Hello students, welcome back. It's Miss Wright. I'm back at it today with another video. Today we'll be learning about narrative voice. Um, just a heads up, everything that I'll be covering today in the video will also be covered in the slides, so if there's anything you want to go back and reference, there will be a slide about it. So, getting right into it, what is narrative voice? It is the perspective through which the author tells us the story. So please don't confuse this with point of view. There is a difference between voice and point of view. Point of view is the perspective, like first person, second person, or third person, that the narrator is telling the story through. Narrative voice is the writer's style or use of language. It's like when you're telling your friend a story and you have your own, there's a pitch in your voice or inflection or certain vocabulary you use or phrases you use that, are very unique to you and your friends recognize as your own voice. That's your narrative voice. So when you're reading, where narrative voice comes from is when the author writes the story, they create the narrator or the speaker. You can use those interchangeably. And then that narrator or speaker tells us the story. Sometimes the narrator is a character within the story. Sometimes it's just, kind of a voice that's telling us what's going on. An important part of the narrative voice is the point of view that the author chooses to use. We've been mostly dealing with first person, where it's I and me and we. So how does different narrative voice choices affect us as the reader? Different voices convey different messages to us when we're reading a text. So if the narrator has a really strong, logical, clear voice, we're very inclined to trust them and believe what they have to say. And if they have a really interesting voice, we want to hear more. But if the narrator's voice is really weak or unsure of themselves, then, as we read whatever the text is, we're not super likely to believe them or to trust them. Or if there's a really boring, just kind of bland narrative voice, we don't really care to hear more. There is a really popular phenomenon where it's called the unreliable narrator, where the author will on purpose have the narrator or the speaker that's telling us the story give us a bunch of inconsistencies so we don't trust them and they seem kind of sneaky. It's called having an unreliable narrator. So that's a really important part of narrative voice when you're choosing how you want to tell a story, or as a reader, how much you want to trust who's telling you the story. So I do have in the slides a couple different examples of the same information being presented explicitly while, we kind of get a different picture when we read both of them because of different styles of narrative voice. So for the first one I have, she marched down the bustling street, glaring at anyone who dared to make eye contact. I knew she'd never look twice at me, and I almost admired her for it. It's example number one. Example number two, she walked down the street looking ahead. She seemed preoccupied, but I couldn't tell why. So in both sentences, they're both told from the same point of view. I'm telling you from first person point of view that a woman is walking down the street and she's not looking at anybody, and she kind of seems, like she's not paying attention really to what's around her. But the way I chose to tell you painted two very different pictures in your head. So in the first example, where she marched down the street glaring at anybody who dared to make eye contact with her, the narrator has a very strong voice, and they're very certain about what they're saying, and it's very detailed, and the words are very strong. And when the narrator's describing their thoughts, they say, I knew she'd never look twice at me. It's a very certain voice, and the narrator gives the impression that they know what they're talking about. In the second example, it's not as interesting to listen to. She didn't march or glare, she walked and looked. When the narrator is describing their own thoughts, instead of saying I knew, they say I couldn't tell. So, maybe you don't trust this narrator quite as much. They seem a little flimsy, and you just don't really care to hear what they have to say because it's boring. Gonna skip that. So to just kind of do a recap on implicit messages, which you guys have been doing a fantastic job on for the past few weeks. Implicit messages are something that tells us how the world should work without really saying it. So a really good example is if somebody were to say, she's good at Rocket League for a girl. Explicitly, they didn't necessarily say anything negative about girls being bad at video games, but the implicit message is that girls are worse at video games than boys all the time, so they should be held to a lower standard. So when a girl is good at a video game, you kind of have to say for a girl to let the person you're talking to know that, the standard is here, but we're kind of lowering it to here for her. So, can narrative voice affect implicit messages? So in our earlier example about the girl walking down the street, both sentences outright give us really similar information, but we're not getting the same messages from the two examples because the narrator's voice, the speaker's voice, gives us hints about what we're supposed to infer from those sentences. So in the first example, we get marched and glared. So those are really sharp words with a very hard edge. And they say that they know that the woman would never look twice at them. So these details kind of rely on the implicit message that people who carry themselves really resolutely, and women specifically, when they don't make eye contact with people, they're typically perceived as really cold and ruthless. So it's very likely that that's the picture that you got in your head when you first read that sentence. In the second example, it doesn't really give us much to work with because it just says walked or looking, I couldn't tell. So we don't get a really solid opinion, and the narrator doesn't really use any implicit messages in what they're trying to tell us. So we kind of just don't get a real solid picture in our head. That is all I've got for you guys on narrative voice and how it has to do with what we're reading and the messages we get from it. Everything, again, will be back in the slides, so if you need to look at anything, if you want to look at the examples, I've got everything in there. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a really good week. You guys have been doing really great work. I know that we've been giving you guys a decent amount to do and really putting you guys to work, and you've been doing a really great job, and we appreciate it. I will see you guys next week.